Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome back. I invite you all to take your seats so we can start again and begin with our session for this afternoon. My name is Côrtes and I'm the board leader for the Western Norway branch of Skeiv Verden Queer World, an organization made by and for queer persons with a minority background. And I am a researcher at Law Transform, the Center on Law and Social Transformation co-owned by the University of Bergen and the Christian Michelsen Institute. At Law Transform, I carry out part of my PhD study on what makes legal mobilization successful through courts or through the legislative arena in countries with a civil law legal system. And I also lead our seminar series, Queer Lawfare, that is about the history and the contemporary challenges of queer rights activism and supported by Fritwood. Law Transform and the Queer Lawfare Seminar Series are proud and honored to be co-organizers of this amazing and fundamental conference. This session follows a schedule that is similar to the one we had this morning, brilliantly chaired by Andrea, so that each speaker will have 30 minutes and we will open for questions if there is time. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Swati Shah, is sick and can't join us today, so we will have 5 minutes more for each speaker for Q&A and then have a break after the two speakers we are hearing from. As many have mentioned here, this is a year of celebration in Norway in spite of the hatred forces that threaten our rights and our lives. In this context, we need initiatives like this one that are propositive arenas for understanding and debating not only the achievements, but also the challenges that we still face in Norway and beyond. And for learning from different perspectives. In that sense, and as an academic and an activist, I'm thrilled to see a number of my academic fellows here and also my activist fellows, both in the audience and at this stage. This can illustrate the importance of this conference. Then, not to waste time, I would like to present our first speaker this afternoon. He is joining us online. And I come from Brazil, so I have been reading and looking up to his work for a long time now. LGBTQ rights are one of the focus for his work, and he has published extensively on that, particularly addressing the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean. Earlier this year, he published a book on the politics of LGBTQ rights expansion in Latin America and Caribbean, and now we will hear from him about the expansion of LGBT rights in the Americas and backlash. I welcome the Professor of Political Science at the Amherst College, Javier Corrales.
Thank you. Why don't I begin by making sure that everybody can hear me? Great. What a wonderful pleasure and what a huge sadness to be online rather than in person to be speaking with you. I was about ready to board my plane when I discovered that I was sick and that it was better for me to stay behind. I was really looking forward to this meeting and to hear all these wonderful presentations. I was more looking forward to hearing from others than actually me presenting. But so I'm very sad that I couldn't join, but I am at the same time delighted that we can do this via Zoom. I hope people don't have too much Zoom fatigue in life, and if you do, my apologies. So what I would do is perhaps maybe I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I want to say a few words about my PowerPoint presentation, and then I guess I'll I'll go back to the moderator and see what is best to do after that. Okay, all right. So what I want to talk about. So I'm a professor of political science, and I don't study history, although of course I'm very informed by history. What I want to argue is, using the case of Latin America, is that I'm going to make a bold statement, and the bold statement is that I probably think that the LGBTQ rights movements in the Americas is one of the most successful ever in Latin America. And this is a little bold, and I'm just offering it for discussion. And the reason that I want to make this point is because the legal changes that the movement has achieved, the debates that it has prompted, the the arguments that they have won are impressive in their own right, but they're even more impressive considering the pervasiveness of homophobia in Latin America and the Caribbean, which continues to be a land of patriarchy and machismo. So this is the most impossible terrain one could imagine, although of course there were opportunities to be exploited. So that's why I think it's one of the most successful movements. So that's going to be my first point. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this was achieved and how institutions helped, but in many ways it was really the work of underground, innovative strategizing on the part of leaders of these movements. But then I want to talk about the backlash, and the backlash is very serious in the region. It is very serious in the region because it is being led by a particular religion that is expanding or has already expanded significantly. And that's the kind of evangelicalism that we're seeing in Latin America. And I want to say something about this. I want to study evangelicals in Latin America from the point of view of social science theory to be able to say that this is a very difficult force to contend with that has acquired a degree of power that wasn't available before. And I want us to become familiar with the kind of movement that evangelicalism has become outside of what it does in religion and being a faith organization, but what it's doing politically. And and then I want to conclude. The last point I want to make is to say a little bit about populism in the region. And what I'm going to argue is that we're seeing way too many examples of populist leaders in Latin America in the last 10, 15 years seeking a marriage of convenience with evangelicals. This is kind of shocking because we didn't see it coming. We used to think that populists didn't need this kind of help. But what we're seeing is that populists on the right, but also on the left, are leaning more and more on evangelicals. And I want to offer some hypotheses as to why this may be happening, and only for discussion because it's very new thinking on my part, and that may be obvious. But the overall conclusion is that you have a region where you have a strong LGBT movement with huge gains in many countries, but facing a very strong backlash because evangelicalism is rising, and now evangelicalism and populism, which has always been strong in Latin America, are forming political alliances. So let's get going with my points. All right, so the achievements of the movement. You may be familiar with this map. It's one of the many maps that is produced documenting the expansion of LGBTQ rights in the region. And here's one way, and it's a very important one. Of course, we know same-sex marriage and discriminatory laws is only the very beginning, but it's a huge thing. And what you can see from this map is that the Western hemispheres, but especially most Latin American and Caribbean countries, have the right color, are on par with some of the most progressive European countries. And on this question of this particular type of marriage, right? And so this is something that has occurred in the last 15 years. And believe me when I say, 20 years ago, I don't think I would have seen this coming. So it is truly remarkable. It is outside of the North Atlantic and, of course, Australia and New Zealand. It is the one region in the world where, if you don't know where you're going to be born as a person, and you have a high probability of being a queer person, you may want to wish that you were born in one of these countries in the Americas because of the legal situation that LGBTQ groups have achieved in the last years. This is a little bit of how it happened. It happened very quickly. Here we have three important laws: the rise of civil unions, the rise of civil marriage, and the rise of gender identity laws. And so, it started in 2006, 2007, and by 2020, we have a really impressive collection of countries. It's really, I love the direction. This is, an upward, and so this is excellent. What I've done here is to list. I know this is very difficult to see. You cannot see the countries, and I apologize for that. But what I want you to notice from this slide is that despite the gains, it is possible, nevertheless, to divide the region into at least three categories of LGBTQ rights. Some countries fall under comprehensive achievement, others fall under partial, and another third category is minimal. The point of this, and so what this chart does is it goes country by country. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Uh, uh, but I'm going to use it and hope that you can see it. But I will also pretend that you're not seeing. You cannot see it. Okay, thank you. All right. So each column here represents a particular right, an important right, like the right to serve on the military, or the right to adopt kids, or a gender identity law, a number of rights, and so we have 9 possible columns, 9 possible categories. And blue cells mean that the country achieved them. And as you can see, some of the most important achievers um, um, in terms of having been able to obtain all these laws, or the majority of them, are this group that I label comprehensive. But then there are others who are more mixed, and then there are some that are really lagging behind. The ones that are lagging behind tend to be in Central America or in the Caribbean, or are very poor. So there is I always make this case that the region is uneven, a little bit like Europe to some extent, with truly impressive achievements in some countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and some countries with very minimal achievements like Venezuela or Guatemala in Central America. Okay. So it's also important to note that this remarkable LGBTQ legal transformation, even in the countries where it has been very comprehensive, has not yet fully addressed some of the most important political concerns of the trans community in Latin America. And this is a very important point that is worth remarking. In Latin America, the trans community faces very high levels of discrimination in the labor market. And for that reason, they have they live under poverty and exclusion, and many times have to devote themselves to sex work because of these barriers. And in Latin America, any type of economic activity that happens at the street level, at the level of informality, is a high risk career of all kind. And in the case of trans individuals, they are especially exposed to all the horrible things about the police in Latin America, which many times act as the most important offenders of human rights. So the police in Latin America engage in quite a bit of use and abuse of the services provided by trans folks. So we are still shocked every time we get reports that demonstrate that the trans community in Latin America is the victim of quite a bit of abuse by police forces, violence by being exposed to street work, and of course, all the problems associated with poverty and lack of access to decent jobs. So this is a real gap, and it's worth remembering that we're nowhere near where we could be with the trans community. Nevertheless, the story, in my opinion, is absolutely transformative. It really is. I really like to talk about all the positive things about Latin America. And I do have to say that when you look at the legal codes and some of the anti-discrimination stipulations in some of these most comprehensive achievers in Latin America, they're very progressive and truly amazing. And here is my evidence on behalf of why this was a spectacular achievement. This is one of the many polls we have documenting the degree of homo and transphobia. There are many others, but I just focused on this one. This is from the Pew Research Center, coming from the mid 2010s. And here is asking people the very basic question: are you in favor or are you opposed to legal gay marriage? And what I want you to notice is that, except perhaps in Uruguay and Argentina, in all the countries in the region, the vast majority of the population, 6 or 7 years ago, it might have changed in some of these countries, but 6 or 7 years ago, were opposed to it, where this is the majority was against it. And yet, LGBTQ movements did not wait for culture to change in order to change the law. But in order to be able to change the law where the culture was behind, they really needed to use important instruments that were a bit odd. First of all, they needed to avoid plebiscites, of course, because they knew they were going to lose. They needed to realize that the Congresses were not going to help, that the political parties weren't going to be strong allies. And they had to do it through all kinds of different means, and one of which was by lobbying the courts, which is how in some countries the rights have come down. The courts have proven to be the most important champions. But this has produced a bit of a backlash. Now, before I talk about that, the other thing that has helped the groups, one is the availability of courts, so that would be the first one. But the other institution that has helped is in countries where you see a significant degree of party competition, and you find parties that want to capture the urban vote. It doesn't happen everywhere, but we saw it in Argentina and Uruguay. There you can see parties on both sides of the spectrum trying to compete against each other by trying to be more pro LGBTQ. And we saw this in Argentina and Uruguay. In other countries, LGBTQ movements have used federalism. They cannot win at the national level, so they start to work at the subnational level, a little bit like the way the United States did it in the very beginning. And a similar strategy has been done in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. So the most federalist cases are the ones that were able to achieve greatest achievements. But like I was saying, really the most important institution that has come to the help of these movements have been the courts. This is so odd for me to be saying this because in Latin America, we tend to have a very low esteem of courts. We tend to see them as co-opted and inefficient and a little bit too in favor of elites. But the truth of the matter is that in the comprehensive cases, they have done really phenomenally in understanding the importance of playing a big role in making sure that these rights can be promoted without causing too much of an earthquake. All right, let me say something about the backlash. And what we're seeing is that because of this progress, homophobia has come out of the closet. Maybe 15 years ago, before these campaigns emerged, there were many people who never even asked themselves how they stood on this question. They probably thought it was disgusting, to think about LGBTQ people, and that was the end of that. They didn't have to, and because of the debates generated and also the decisions that were made, people have been forced to come out publicly in terms of whether they are in favor of these changes or not. And we're seeing that homophobia has come out, that people have felt very comfortable expressing opinions in favor, but also expressing for the first time opinions against it. And the opinions against them, now public and now out there, have been used by politicians to their advantage. Politicians have discovered that this is now a cleavage in Latin America that perhaps was dormant before, that could be mobilized whenever you need a little bit of help. And some populists are beginning to do this, and the evangelicals. Let me skip this one for a moment, and let me start to talk about religion a little bit. All right. I was arguing that the transformation of the legal environment in the region in terms of LGBTQ rights has been spectacular in the comprehensive countries. I also mentioned that there has been a bit of a backlash, which is not that small. Now I want to mention what I think is the most dramatic way that, in my opinion, Latin America and the Caribbean demographic has changed in the last 40 years. And it has to do with the religious composition of the region. I divided into 4 categories of people. The region is developing 4 categories. On the left arrow, I have grouped 2 groups of religious demographics, what we would call irreligious people and light Catholics. On the right arrow, I have evangelicals and conservative Catholics. These are very different groups. These are very different ways in which individuals think of their religious identity. And what has happened is that these groups are each getting strong, if you can imagine. And let me say something about this, about each of them. So irreligious people are people who basically are very secular. And 40 years ago, this group would have been minuscule in Latin America. It is now fairly large and growing. In addition, we have a group that, for a lack of a better word, I call light Catholics. These are non-practicing Catholics. They are people who still identify as Catholic, feel proud of that religious heritage, are not at war with religion or their church, but don't practice the religious rites, seldom go to church, don't go to Mass, and they only go to Mass for the very big occasions. This is also a rising movement because we used to have Catholics who were basically more practicing. All right, now on the other side, we have the evangelicals. The evangelicals, often called in Latin America Pentecostals, are the fastest growing demographic in the region. 40 years ago, these groups were negligible, and now in some countries, they have been able to achieve almost half of the religious groups. They're big in Brazil, they're big in Central America, they are expanding in Chile, and they have always been very big in the Anglo-speaking Caribbean. And what is happening with them, and I'm going to show a graph to show, is that they have become more and more socially conservative. And now they're also being joined by conservative Catholics, which is a group that is also growing. It's a group that they are practicing Catholic, but they, like evangelicals, are also becoming socially more conservative as well. And the two issues that are mobilizing these 2 religious groups are, of course, abortion rights and LGBTQ rights. Let me say something more about evangelicals, because I find the emergence of evangelicals in the region the most, not only important demographic change, but also the most important political change. Let me just skip to this chart here. Sorry. Wait. Oh, sorry. All right. So I wrote a paper with a friend, and we looked at the views of different religious groups in Colombia. And again, it's only Colombia, so it could be different in other countries. And we looked at surveys. It was broken down by religious identity, and their views on what we could call some sins, and the sins that we looked. And so we broke it down by Catholics, evangelical, and those who say that they have no religion at all, so the irreligious, and then Protestants who are more mainstream Anglican. It's a small moral group. And what I want you to notice here is the social conservatism of evangelicals, even in relationship to Catholics. So in the first gram, we found, what do they think about divorce? In the second one is, what do they think about euthanasia? What do they think about homosexuality? The next one is, what do they think about marijuana use? What do they think about premarital sex? And the last one is, what do you think about same-sex marriage? And in the only chart where there's convergence across the four religious groups, the only one is on marijuana. Everybody of these groups is opposed to it, except perhaps those who are not that religious. But in the other categories, the other sins, to use words that they themselves use, evangelicals are the most conservative. They are systematically the most opposed, and especially on the question of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. It's a very, very robust finding. So the laity of evangelicals in Colombia are very, very socially conservative, and they're growing. They're becoming huge numbers in not just Colombia, but many other countries. Now, let me say something. I'm not a religious scholar, but for those of you who may need a little bit of help on where this homophobia coming, the book of Leviticus from the Bible has two of the most homophobic statements, which is you can see them here in Leviticus 18:22. You can find the very famous passage, "You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It's an abomination." And evangelicals talk about queer identities as abominations. The other one, also from Leviticus, says, if there is a man who lies, hold on, I have to move my. If there's a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman, both of them have committed a detestable act. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. Right? So this is where this all comes from. But the very strange thing about this is that the Old Testament, but especially Leviticus, has even more horrible things to say about other sins. And you can see the cherry picking. Here is a list of things that that other books in the Old Testament, like Romans and Deuteronomy, they're against witches. They're against people who don't observe the Sabbath. They're against people who do not respect their parents, and they want to kill them. One of the most important one is they are against adultery. Oh, sorry, it's this one right here. And you don't see evangelicals or conservative Catholics becoming obsessed about any of these things. They have really, really, really zeroed in on homosexuality in terms of the things that they could be against. And that's a bit of an aside, because there is a significant degree of cherry picking in deciding what is going to be the social force that they're going to be. I find it amazing that they seem to be very relaxed about adultery, when adultery is one of those sins that is very repeatedly condemned in the Old Testament. And you don't see them campaigning against divorce laws at all, but you do see them campaigning against LGBTQ rights laws. Now, the remarkable thing about evangelicals is that as NGOs, they are impossible to beat. They have a significant reach across all sectors of society. At one point, they were growing in Colombia one church per month. This is incredible. They often have media empires, TV stations, radio stations, a lot of presence in social media. They also are. They're not obsessed with Islam in Latin America, so they don't have the desire that they need to appear a little bit more open-minded towards LGBTQ rights in order to differentiate themselves from Islam. So they feel very comfortable being very socially conservative because they don't have to worry about the expansion of Islam in Latin America. They have used a very effective form of framing, which is, if two women want to get married, fine, but do not mess with my children. Let me protect my children from these ideologies. Here's the version in Espanol, con mis hijos no te metas. And they have created this idea that we have the right to protect our children from being taught these crazy ideologies. And so they have organized themselves along the question of we're against the ideology of gender, which is their view of what LGBTQ rights and also all forms of feminist thinking is about, a type of ideology that they themselves have the right to protect their children against. In other words, they don't see it as a human rights defense, but as an ideological battle. Here's another example of some of the mobilizations that have taken place in the region. And this is allowing evangelicals to reach out to lay folks, because lay folks respond to this idea that we're defending our autonomy to protect our children. One of the most famous persons to reach to the top was this gentleman here who came very close to winning the presidential race in Costa Rica, himself a pastor. And he was defeated in the end, and that's a remarkable story of how that happened. But he basically campaigned with this no a la ideología de género way of framing things. The other thing that they're doing is to say that the LGBTQ movement is an undemocratic movement because they are refusing the Irish experience of doing plebiscites. They want to determine all of this with plebiscites because they think that the only way of being democratic is through majoritarian consultation. Of course, that's a very limited view of what democracy is about. There are times when in democracy you want to use majoritarian decision-making instruments, but for civil rights, we certainly know that we don't want to use majoritarian polls. But they accuse LGBT folks of using non-democratic instruments like relying on the courts or bureaucrats or even liberal elites and avoiding the ballot. And this has been a winning argument in some cases. Evangelicals are spreading very fast because it's very easy to become a pastor. In Latin America, you don't really need a license to practice as a pastor. You just have to be endorsed by other pastors. So this is why these churches are spreading very quickly. They also work together. They're very male-dominated. So you see the rise of the patriarchy with most pastors, even though they allow women. Most pastors tend to be men. I'm going to show you a picture in a moment. This is a shocking picture from Colombia as well. When Colombia had its peace agreement, the evangelical community campaigned against the peace agreement because the peace agreement was the first peace agreement of its kind to include LGBTQ language in it. It was truly revolutionary. So the evangelicals were appalled, and they campaigned against the agreements and defeated them in a plebiscite. And they demanded to have a meeting with the president of the country for them to express their opposition. And here's a picture of that meeting. And imagine here, the president is at the back, and you are being visited by all these men, all evangelicals carrying Bibles, telling you this is an abomination. there is, if I can imagine a better picture of the patriarchy alive at the moment from Latin America, I don't think I could come up with anything like this, especially in Latin America where cabinets have more women and are much more diverse. But there you have it. And what's so shocking about this is that, again, in evangelicalism, there are female pastors. It's not like in the Catholic Church where there can only be men in the priesthood. So this is an important power resource that they have. The other is that they can mobilize resources because they're tax exempt. In most countries, they don't have to file income or tax, and they never get audited, and they are almost seldom scrutinized. So, in the sake of time, let me just show you some pictures of some of Latin America's most famous populists courting evangelicals. Here's Álvaro Uribe, who was president of Colombia, himself a Catholic, being baptized. Let me skip this one. Here is, the president of Brazil, also being baptized. I have some quotes about him. For the interest of time, I'm going to skip them. Happy to share them. This is also happening elsewhere with in Putin. In the case of Russia, we're seeing a huge alliance between Putin and the conservative elements of the Russian Orthodox Church. Let me also move forward, skip Turkey. I don't have time for this, but let's go back to Mexico. He is from the left, currently the president of Mexico, has significant impulses of populism, and there he is meeting with evangelical pastors. At least here there are a couple of women. But then again, it's a very similar picture. They're being confronted with quite a bit of pressure from them, and they're courting. And of course, the biggest populist turning to evangelicals would have been Donald Trump. So this is an image that I placed here, so that you see that this is now a global trend of right-wing or left-wing populists approaching and making political alliances with social conservatism. In the case of the United States, this alliance paid off, with evangelicals voting for Trump at a very high level. The bad news, and then this is my last slide, and then I'll stop. I'm sorry that I went over, and if you give me one more minute, I'll try to be economical. This is what I have been saying is the bad news. At the level of religion, evangelicalism and Catholic and social and conservative Catholicism is rising. You have parties that are not coming out in favor of LGBTQs. You have many courts that some have been very assertive, but others have not. And the private sector is often a little bit too quiet and not that supportive. But the good news that is countering this, and I want to finish with a good note, is that the rise of evangelicalism is being countered by the fact that there's a lot of irreligiosity among young people, and they are very pro-LGBTQ. The left is beginning to embrace LGBTQ movements in the region, so this is a good trend. We're seeing courts adopt the notion of transnational legalism, which is even if they don't have a precedent of being progressive, they can borrow precedents from other countries and become more progressive themselves. And the private sector has, in some cases, been mobilized on behalf of the cause. It's a very controversial position, but many times when the private sector is on board on behalf of LGBTQ rights, LGBTQ movements have a better chance of prevailing. Those were my remarks. Thank you so much for your attention, and my apologies for going over my time.
Thank you, Javier. It was our pleasure to hear to your enlightening presentation. And now we have time for one question from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please go to the side here.
Thank you, Javier. As you mentioned, part of the explanation for the progress of the region lies in the social movement, and I was wondering if you can elaborate further on that. Like, especially, I would like to know what have you found about the composition of the social movement, about the allies of the social movement, and the networks that it has created. Thank you.
Great. So, what is so remarkable is that I am not a scholar of social movements, so I'm going to be stepping into territories that other colleagues have explored better than I have. But it is a very important question because I think the spirit of your question is, are there lessons to be drawn from the social movement experience in Latin America that could be applied to other groups? And I think the answer is yes. The most important effective thing that I think LGBTQ movements have done in Latin America is they have talked about LGBTQ movements as a human rights condition. The way that they have framed this, the way that they have framed the importance of making sure that it is impossible to talk about participatory democracy without discussing sexual citizenship. Because in Latin America at the moment, these two buzzwords, human rights and participatory democracy, are so huge. Their ability to be able to connect the cause with these two buzzwords has been huge. I also mentioned that I didn't mention that an important ally has been feminist movements. I've talked to scholars of feminism, and what they say is, it's interesting. Feminist movements in Latin America are far more powerful, far more organized, far more mobilized. And it has been smart for LGBTQ movements to join with them to get momentum. But what is kind of interesting is that in the end, it's been the LGBTQ movement that has achieved more gains in some areas, not all areas, but in some areas. So allies are absolutely indispensable. And I'm glad that you asked that question. And I do venture to say that it's a case worth studying for lessons to be drawn for other regions and movements facing equal challenges.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you very much for your answer to Juliana's question and for your presentation today. Now we are going on to our next inspiring speaker, Professor Sylvia Tamale, who is a professor of law at the Makerere University. She is a leading African feminist lawyer, sociologist, and human rights activist, who has won prizes and awards for defending human rights of marginalized groups, such as women, sex workers, homosexuals, and refugees. Someone else's. So Professor Tamale became the first female dean of Makerere University Law School in 2004. And further, she has been a visiting professor at the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town and a visiting scholar at the University of Wisconsin, and has served on the boards of the Uganda HIV/AIDS Alliance, the Global Commission on HIV, and the Law and the International Council on Human Rights Policy. We are all very lucky to have her here in Bergen today, joining us, and to have the opportunity to hear from her about sexualities and the uses of history in different African contexts. Professor, please.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Come again.
Hello. It is an honor and great pleasure for me to stand before you this evening, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to come to this beautiful Bergen. I've noted that most of the presentations from yesterday are reiterating the same issues, and mine is not going to be different. And I'm focusing on Africa, really picking up from where Anzio Jacobs left off. Now, recently, a young 22-year-old intern, let me call her Akelo, she came to my office. She had come to assist with some IT problem when she saw this old newspaper clip on my notice board in the office. And the following conversation ensued between us. She said, "That looks like you." And I said, "Yes, it is. In 2003, I was voted Worst Woman of the Year by New Vision readers." What? Why would they do that? Well, the worst man in the poll that year was LRA rebel leader Joseph Kony, who murdered, mutilated, and raped many people in northern Uganda. And I was voted Worst Woman because of my support for the rights of sexual minorities like homosexuals and sex workers. Long pause. And then she said, "I would have voted the same way." But aren't those homos a recent phenomenon in Uganda? I hear homosexuality was imported from Europe. End of our conversation. Now, this afternoon, I'm going to briefly sketch the politics of queer history in Africa by presenting its weaponized uses to both oppress and to liberate. I do this by exposing the distorted historiographies of African sexualities and gender identities. I also present counter-histories that reveal a different reality. The presentation begins by answering the question, why history matters, before unpacking the weaponization of African queer history. Next, I attempt to lift the veil from the face of non-conforming sexualities in Africa and end with a brief conclusion. Now, to address the earlier question about the term Africa or African that was asked, given the rich diversity that characterizes the geographical space that was baptized Africa, let me say very briefly that the African identity was really a figment of European imagination in a bid to other its people as uncivilized, with primitive, backward cultures, and so on. But I think for the purpose of our decolonization and decolonial projects, I think it is extremely important to treat Africa as one historical and political unit. It is strategic, okay? So the vast majority of the continent, it is, I think, very important because the vast majority of the continent shares the common history of slavery and the common legacies of colonialism and oppression. So it is used advisedly, in short. Now, why history matters? The main reason why queer history matters in Africa is because queer people continue to be legally and socially persecuted, violated, maligned, and dehumanized on a daily basis. History plays an important role in revealing misconceptions, illogical suppositions, and untruths that saturate dominant narratives about sexualities. Indeed, queer history is extremely important for decolonial queer theorization on the continent. In that sense, it is a crucial element in deepening our understanding, as well as critiquing and transforming relations of power. It is in queer history and Eurocentrism that we find the seeds of obligatory heterosexuality, queerphobia, transphobia, and intersectional discrimination on the African continent. I want to quote decolonial theorist Paulo Bacheta, who reminds us that relations of power that extend across the social realm and into our most intimate lives are more complex than they initially might seem. Colonialism, coloniality, racism, capitalism all carry forms of genealogical accumulation that are fully operative in the present. This means that every contemporary context is an amalgamation of past and present manifestations of power that interact and enact in the present. Queer history is important not because it follows some linear deterministic path, but because it has been weaponized for political gain. As we know, history is used by powerful forces to exploit the meanings of lives, even the very meaning of humanity, mainly to further their own agendas. When the histories of gender and sexualities in Africa are narrated, particularly in political spaces by state officials, religious leaders, and other influential community leaders, the tendency is to subtract, shift, appropriate, and even disappear the contours of their reality. These factors largely explain Akello's clouded and misguided judgment about queer people in Uganda. We also know that history is subjective because it is a creation of the people's interpretation of events, shaped by their worldviews and values. Even when grounded in evidence, historical reconstructions are bound to be less than the actual past, as details of bygones can never be fully known. Hence, the fluid nature of history, coupled with its subjective interpretation, means that it is not always a reliable source of information. Yet, some totally ignore history and view reality outside historical context. Such a historical analysis of events, texts, and processes usually result in misconceptions of the past and justifications for current or future oppression. Now I'll try and unpack the weaponization of queer histories. African sexualities have been a huge target of weaponized and poisonous narratives of history aimed at rationalizing the erasure and persecution of queer people. Not only do those with power and privilege distort and rewrite history to suit their populist agendas, but they also rework it to valorize heteronormativity and hegemonic gender ideologies. The fact that sexuality today is draped in the garb of shameful secrets, taboos, and silences makes it easier to misrepresent its variegated realities. But the history of desire and pleasure in Africa is more complex and layered than the dominant ideologies would want us to believe. Who determines what is acceptable or normal sexuality? Who constructs and calibrates the societal sexual moral compass, and to what end? Where is the big sexual cover-up engineered? And who instigates and sustains sexual moral panics? The history of sexualities in Africa is entangled with colonial histories and agendas. imperialism imposed a master narrative on Africa through civilizing knowledge production processes that pretty much erased the continent's history and values. The colonial master narrative became the official historical record, inscribed and officiated through institutions such as education, politics, religion, laws, family language, and the media. The colonial logic and norms were thus globalized with their epistemic biases and blind spots. Most notably, the official historical record omits and denigrates oral history, which is an important part of preserving traditional history in Africa. Most indigenous languages on the continent do not discriminate between the pronouns he and she, which suggests the belief that men and women derive from the same cosmological source. But the weaponized tool of history is double-edged in that it can be deployed to oppress as well as to liberate. When history is excavated from underneath the hips of the hegemonic rubble, submerged voices and uneasy realities are unearthed. Scholars of gender and history have challenged colonial gender tropes, revealing many examples from African societies where the organization of gender was not necessarily arranged along heterosexual or patriarchal lines. In her classic book, Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Ifi Amadiume, for example, explains that in the Igbo Nobi community in southeastern Nigeria, biological sex did not always correspond to ideological gender. Sylvia Tamale also elaborates how gender is a movable feast with no fixed boundaries among the Baganda of Uganda. She explains how Amuganda's bio-social cultural frontiers determined their gender. For example, irrespective of biology, all members of the royal family in Buganda were gendered as men, while all commoners, or Bakopi, within the palace were gendered as females. Such social cultural construction meant that a Muganda princess is a female man, referred to as Sebo or Sir to this very day, and culturally entrusted with masculine roles. Now, when the British colonized Nigeria and Uganda and elsewhere, they imposed their rigid binary gender model while denigrating and supplanting indigenous gender ideologies like those described above. In most traditional African cosmologies, the dead transcend into the spirit world and resurrect or live on among the living as living ancestors. Ancestors may use any living body, regardless of sex, as conduits to exercise their agency through possession. This is why the equivalence of Western secular notions of transgenderism and homosexuality were not unthinkable in African ontological and epistemic framings. The ancestral power of Sangomas of South Africa, as Jacobs told us, and their full-fledged transgender statuses are just one example of this. But when colonialists arrived on the continent, they proceeded to impose their rigid conceptualization of gender onto African communities to fit into the imperatives of capitalist production and reproduction. Traditional spirituality was recast as evil pagan practices and mislabeled as witchcraft, totally disrupting African ways of thinking and being. Furthermore, it is important to point out that Western master narratives of history suggest a linear, chronological, and monolithic version of a given period, which starkly contrasts with traditional African understandings of time that were more cyclical, multidimensional, and constantly moving through a multi-layered space. The standardization of time in the late 19th century forced the world into a common dating framework that perceives a separated past, present, and future. Indeed, key to the processes of universalization was the reconstruction of the concepts of space and time. The homogenization and valorization of temporalities serves concise socio-political and economic goals. Time is a formidable scientific tool at the disposal of Western capitalism to facilitate the processes of exploitation. Scientific discourse makes us believe that time and history are neutral units, but they're actually extremely political with significant implications for queer liberation. The colonial standardization of time, language, religion, law, and other regulatory policies normalized and recoded sexual and gender identities into rigid dichotomous variables, erasing African indigenous paradigms that were more pluralistic, elastic, and accommodating. For example, witchcraft and sodomy prohibition laws were enacted and repugnancy clauses inserted into African legal frameworks that subjugated traditional customs to Western values and norms. I now turn to an examination of Okello's claim, echoed by so many others, about the alleged un-Africanness of queer sexualities. And I want to do this by showing a few very short video clips that Mats was kind enough to put together for me. So please, can you show the clips?
We equally reject attempts to prescribe new rights that are contrary to our values, norms, traditions, and beliefs. We are not gays. Cooperation and respect for each other will advance the cause of human rights worldwide. Confrontation, vilification, and double standards will not.
African bishops meeting in Entebbe, Uganda this week condemned homosexuality, saying it's against the word of God. The Anglican Church has been torn for years by disputes about authority over church teachings, especially on gay rights. The second All-African Bishops' Conference brings together more than 400 African bishops to discuss issues on the continent. Luke Orombi, Archbishop of Uganda, says African churches are not going to compromise their stand against homosexuality.
The Orthodox believers, like we in Africa, the majority of us, have stood clearly to say what my brother Bernard has said. Homosexuality is incompatible with the Word of God. In this country, we cherish the Word of God. And if you are proclaiming that Word of God, you want to stick to it faithfully.
Africans here, we know a few people who are rumored to be homosexuals. Even in history, we had some few being rumored. But you cannot stand up here and say, I'm a homosexual.
Around the world, lesbians, gay men, and bisexual and transgender people are denigrated, attacked, imprisoned, tortured, even killed because of who they are or whom they love. I cannot worship a homophobic God. I oppose such injustice with the same passion that I opposed apartheid.
Thank you very much. That's the late Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Those Anglican bishops, they really didn't see the irony of talking about homosexuality as an African, basing themselves, their arguments on a white God and a white Bible. They just didn't see it. They don't see it. Next, I'm going to try and lift the veil from non-conforming sexualities in Africa. Now, to begin with, it is totally absurd to suggest that any given human activity is un-African. First of all, Africa itself is a construction of colonial domination, as I've said before. So if the entity Africa was a product of the imperialists' imagination, what would the so-called un-African look like? And secondly, realistically, is it possible that 1.4 billion people that currently inhabit the space that was baptized Africa all share monolithic tastes, let alone sexual orientations and gender identities? Finally, what does it mean when it is revealed that traditional African penal systems did not sanction homoerotic practices and that the draconian homophobic laws were an import of white European colonizers? Moreover, while history is important for understanding contexts and prevailing social conditions, by no means does it dictate people's future behaviors. So even if it were true that queer sexualities and identities did not exist in pre-colonial Africa, that fact alone would not shape contemporary sexual practices. Subscribing to such rationalization would also mean that because computer use was not part of Africa's traditional practice, the continent should reject the un-African technology. Cultures, customs, and habits evolve, adapt, and adopt new forms. It is also true that subcultures and countercultures have always existed in practically all cultures. It should also be pointed out that for centuries, same-sex associations were outlawed in numerous Western countries around the world, especially in the colonial countries that sat at Berlin and carved up the African continent. In any case, historians and anthropologists have now put to rest the false claims that homosexuality is not indigenous to Africa through careful analysis of the archives of colonial missionaries, explorers, and traders. Archaeologists have also discovered prehistoric homoerotic images in rocks, in rock art, such as that by Khoisan people found in the Guruve caves of present-day Zimbabwe. Homoeroticism is also depicted in Egyptian art and literature that dates back to the 5th century. Let me illustrate with a few additional examples from around the continent. Given their power and significance, ancient African kingdoms were magnets for early merchants and explorers, and therefore a lot more is known about them. In the kingdom of Buganda, in present-day Uganda, several kabakas or kings, but most notoriously Mwanga II, were known to have indulged in homosexual activity prior to the arrival of Europeans. It is thus not by accident that in the Buganda kingdom, all commoners, regardless of sex, refer to the kabaka as Baffe, our husband. Traditionally, the kabaka had power over the sexuality of his subjects, and same-sex relations were commonplace in the palace. Imperialist laws and Christianity introduced queerphobia and labeled homosexuality as evil. The new converts defied Kabaka Mwanga's homosexual advances, and he ordered their death by slow immolation. Similarly, historical records in the ancient kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin, reveal same-sex sexual patterns. Most significantly, several eunuchs and effeminate men were counted among the palace royal wives, available for the king's sexual pleasure. The Azande people, the British social anthropologist Evans Pritchard spent decades from the 1920s studying the Azande people of Sudan and published many books and articles about their behaviors. However, his personal biases, steeped in Christian homophobia, made him reluctant to report about their deviant sexuality until a few years before he died. In his 1970 article, Sexual Inversion Among the Azande, Evans Pritchard provided details of homosexual relationships among Azande men and women in pre-European times, including marriages between young warriors and their boy wives. Rudolf Gaudio's ethnographic study of the Hausa of West Africa revealed intriguing ontological and epistemological approaches to the understanding of sexuality, including same-sex relations. Like many other non-Western indigenous perceptions of same-sex desires, the Hausa did not view such relations within the identity politics framework of gays, lesbians, and bisexuals that is prevalent in the West. Their understanding of same-sex desire was constructed and mapped differently from the modern Western thinking, which associates it with a distinct identity that adheres to a specific culture and politics. Such relationships were never perceived to be incompatible with heterosexuality, marriage, and parenthood. Similarly, Catherine Kendall, who went to Lesotho in the early 1990s on a search for lesbians, also got a rude awakening when she realized that traditional female-to-female bonding and intimacy, named Motsoale, among the Basotho women was never viewed as an identity category. Because these relationships were exclusively aligned with sexual pleasure without undermining procreation, they were culturally tolerated. I could go on and on with pre-colonial examples that refute the tired cliché that homosexuality is an African. Diverse sexualities, or so-called queerness, has always been part of human existence. So to conclude, I turn to the Sankofa bird, which is a part of a wide range of visual metaphors that represent African philosophical proverbs. The Sankofa is one of the 122 set of ancient and Dikra symbols from the Akan people of West Africa that says, and I quote, "The past has a lot to say." For me, it represents the wisdom of decolonial historical analysis. In today's context, the backward-facing curve of the Sankofa neck represents a useful way of complicating the arbitrariness and irrationality of queerphobic and transphobic political discourse in Africa. Demagogic post-colonial political leaders on the continent have constructed the paradigm of the un-Africanness of queer sexuality and gender queerness, and then proceeded to fill it with untruths that legitimize the persecution and criminalization of those that do not conform to dominant sexual gender norms and practices. Queer history on the continent is key in returning us to the past and understanding the pervasive legal and social injustice that African queer communities face today. It would explain Akelo's ideology-driven confusion about non-conforming sexualities in Uganda. Ultimately, it is a crucial and necessary dimension of transformative politics, decolonization, and liberation in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sylvia Tamale, for one more inspiring contribution and for all the work you have developed and that has inspired so many so far. We have time for 2 questions from the audience or from the Q&A for those who are joining online. So if you'd like to ask a question and are here present, just go to the site and... Okay.
I like this audience.
Yeah.
It's not a question asking audience.
I think we have one question next. Okay, please.
Sorry, I keep asking questions, but it's such a great conference. Why would I not? So I was wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges of sketching out what you call a pre-colonial mapping of same-sex desire through the lens of colonial archives that effectively enact a remapping of those desires. I wonder if you could expand on some of those challenges.
The challenges of?
You were talking about how often there were kind of the way in which same-sex desire was mapped in kind of pre-colonial models was very different to the way that you could see like LGBT identities. So, and you were saying that a lot of the examples were coming from, for instance, like missionary records and things like that. So I was wondering kind of what are the challenges of reconstructing those different mappings through archival records that kind of remap at the same time as they record? Does that make any sense?
Of course, the obvious challenge would be accessing those, but there are quite many actually in the colonial archives. For example, in Oxford and all those archives, and there, I think it would take a very comprehensive project to do it, and some people have started doing it. Some historians have embarked on remapping. I mean, you know, very interesting diary entries, for example, in explorers like Livingstone, what they were observing and what they, you know, like what Pritchard did. He had noted these things, but all the information and data that he had collected, he had decided to leave this aside until a couple of years before he died. But I think I think the challenge is really upon us to take on this. I don't think it's undoable. We can still do it, and of course, the oral history. You know, with every passing day, we lose many of these histories from people that can remember. Some of them are carried through proverbs, through folk songs, and so on. But I think we really need to take on a very deliberate effort to remap using those kinds of alternative archives.
Thank you very much.
You're next, Tony, please.
Thank you so much. I'm blown away by this very nuanced and complex lecture. And continuing on the challenges, now I'm of course very glad to hear that queer history is key. but how your lecture versus the story of queerness as an African, what would be the strategies for challenging this notion of Africa, of queerness as an African? Who would be the audience willing to listen to you, and what kind of dissemination strategies should be used, and who would be the alliances for challenging this very strong narrative of queerness as an African?
I think the Akellos of this world would be the audience. And what I did with Akello was to give her, you know, a few articles of retelling history, because she had only had one story. It's an African, it's an African, it's an African. And she was shocked to discover the history or her story of queerness in Africa. When I gave her, some of the readings, she was shocked. So I think it's really about the victor telling the story. And, I think that, when the victor tells the story, most people believe that that is the story. So it's a question of us publishing, telling stories, using all these various forms of archives that we've been discussing here, and just informing people, because it's really out of ignorance and fear that people, they're hearing only one story, one narrative. And I think, when we tell a different, an alternative story, many people are shocked because they didn't know that that history existed. So it's really, like they are fellows of the audience, and they just need to be told the truth.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, so please.
I must start, Professor, by saying it's a great honor to be in the same room as you and to speak on the same platform as you. And I wanted to ask a question that may be a bit out there. Africans have suffered so much pillage in the colonial project and have lost so much. And I think that in many instances where there's been violence, there's a need for mourning. And so I wondered if you could maybe just reflect on this for a moment and think with me, what would it mean if we were to mourn as Africans what was lost, and what would it mean for us to retrieve then what was lost in that moment as we create new futures? I know that that is a very vast and ambiguous question, but I wonder if you could perhaps help me beginning to try and unpack what mourning could look like.
Very sobering question. I hadn't thought about it, but I think it's an issue that is worth thinking about. I don't think I can give you an answer right now, but I'm certainly promising you that I'll think about it. How do we? And it's not just queerness. There's a lot to mourn on the continent. There's a lot to mourn. How do we do it? I think maybe the first thing we need to do is, because you cannot mourn what you don't know. A Kelo will not know that there's anything to mourn. So I think that the first important thing is to bring clarity to what the problem that we face is, so that Africans, especially young Africans, see clearly with a 2020 vision what the problem is, and to know and understand what it is that we're up against. Because I don't think that there is that clarity. It's been clouded by a very well-engineered machinery, imperialist machinery, and the compradors, the leaders that act as their agents on the continent. So let us not give up, because it may seem too big, and you may seem too small to take this up, to take it on. But I think we, each step, each person, one at a time, clarify what it is that we're fighting, because decolonization and decoloniality are huge, huge projects that we must take up. Break until.
Thank you for your answers to the questions from the audience. I would like to just say thank you again, Professor Tamale, for your answers and for the whole of your talk. I will borrow Anzio's words to say it's an honor to be here with you and to chair this panel. So we have a break now, and we will see you again at 2:40. Yeah, for the last panel today. in which Matt Cook will lead the discussion on the promise and future of queer history making, and all speakers of this conference are welcome to attend. Hello. Hello and welcome again to the last panel of this amazing conference. I will now invite and leave the floor to Matt Cook, who is a cultural historian specialized in the history of sexuality and the history of London in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's a professor of modern history and assistant dean and head of the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology at Birkbeck, London University. He has also advised on a number of community and oral history, archive and museum projects, with standout ones involving queer rights. Moreover, in 2014, he was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship by the Higher Education Academy for his work at Birkbeck and in archive and community settings. He will, as I said before the break, lead the panel discussion on the promise and future of queer history making, and everybody is welcome to watch, and all the speakers are invited to join the discussion. Thank you, and please. Thank you.
Do you have Seems like I can't wear my glasses and my and my headphones. We'll see how we get on. So thank you so much. You've made it through to the final session, and I'm really excited to have this tremendous panel of speakers with us. I wanted to start by echoing the thanks others have given to the organisers. This really has been a spectacular conference. I want to thank the audience. You've been incredibly attentive, fantastic questions. The discussions in the breaks have been really, really energising and fascinating. And actually, I wanted to thank the organisers for provisioning us so well in the breaks. It really helps. You know, people haven't been disappearing. We've been staying around for coffee and cake and chats, and that's really helped, I think, the kind of flow of discussion and so on. So you've really fostered important spaces for queer historical thinking and imagining. So our very small task over the next hour is to think about the future of queer history. And we'll see where we get to. How I wanted to handle this is I'm going to turn over to the panel shortly, but I wanted to kind of kick off by making a few observations about the conference, about some of the things I've noticed or learnt over the last 2 days, and maybe say something very briefly about how this relates to this loose field of history as it's developed, and which I think underpins the promise of queer history going forward. Now, when Turner said, it'd be good if you could give some sort of overview of the conference at the start of this panel, I thought, well, how do I do this thing? So I do what I often do when I don't know what to do, and I made a list. And I've made a list of 10 things, some of which might seem very obvious. But I think they're worth noting because they are not at all usual things to find in a history conference. And so might help us to think about what marks out queer historical work, and so also what it has to offer in the future. So, in no particular order, here's number one, which was that speakers on both days have made very clear that making queer and trans history is not a marginal pursuit of interest only to a minority. And that's because queer histories and queer lives have been culturally central in defining shifting norms and have been central in the rhetoric and action of politicians and evangelicals and others in consolidating their power consolidating their nation and fighting wars, literal wars. This afternoon, Sylvia further signalled the importance of queer historical work in historicising and so also denaturalising norms and traditions those politicians, evangelicals and many others have also mobilised. So, number 2. We've looked to Russia, Hungary and Ukraine, to Turkey, Southern Africa, India, South America and the USA. This reach has sadly not been typical of all queer history conferences, but it is crucial going forward to interrogating sameness and difference in connected ways, and is one really crucial strand in decolonising queer history making, not least in those conceptual ways of thinking about time and space which we were thinking about this afternoon. I'd also note, however, that this has been an Anglophone conference, as so often, with all that that suggests in terms of cultural and linguistic power and the issues of translation that we discussed yesterday. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact these conferences are often and almost inevitably conducted in English. The third, we're moving through, I will speed up. I put the big thoughts first, maybe. The speakers have also taken the movement of ideas and people and of border crossings very seriously, and have looked at the way these movements inflect and are inflected by local lives. I've been really compelled by the way several speakers have held the global and the local together, and lightly. I think it's incredibly impressive and important thing to do, so that we don't kind of allow one to monopolise over the other. Fourth, the conference has included work by historians, ethnographers, anthropologists, political scientists, filmmakers, activists, sharpening our sense of the relationship between history and activism, and of history in and for the present. And so, why history matters now. And I'll say a bit more, I think, shortly about the importance of these disciplinary boundary crossings in queer historical work. It's also bridged different areas of history: political history, social history, cultural history, legal history, global history, micro-history, gender history, public history, opening the question for me of whether the queer historical project is best seen as cross-cutting rather than discrete and separate. There has been, this is number 6, as standard in the presentations, an interrogation of supposed obvious or natural frames of reference and analysis, including the nation, the law, identity, and crucially, the discipline of history itself and the space and limits of the archive. Several speakers have vividly demonstrated the damage, the really profound damage these categories of knowledge and understanding have inflicted on people's lived realities. 7, speakers have relatedly looked intersectionally in relation to class, caste, race, and they've reached across gender. There has been a consideration of the dance and intersection of queer and normal. In the conference as a whole, as well as in some individual talks, queer and trans histories have come together, I think, in really productive ways. That has too often not been the case in past conferences. 8, there's been, I think, an acknowledgement not of the separation. Oh, I've said that. We're going straight on to 9. The conference has been especially marked by speakers owning and being acutely aware of their own position and privilege in relation to what they say. And they've also acknowledged and described their collaborations with archivists, activists, with those they have interviewed, those who thus underpin their work. As crucially, there's been acknowledgement of those whose voices are lost, who can't say or can't speak. And I was very struck and moved by this discussion of mourning this afternoon, the importance of mourning the voices that we can't hear. But this acknowledgement that I've really noticed across these 2 days is also not standard in history conferences. There's this idea of the sole historian, and I think what I've got out of the last 2 days is a real sense of collaboration and an acknowledgement of what underpins the work that we're doing. And so speakers have shown that people and their voices matter. Biography matters in the history we create, and that the people listening and watching and reading these histories matter. There's a particular cognizance, I think, amongst people working in queer scholarship and queer history of wider audiences and the political import of this historical work, of queer histories mattering much more directly and immediately than some other sub-disciplines. And then 2 final points. I was struck here, as in a conference, queer history conference in San Francisco a couple of months ago, that the centre of gravity is very much the recent past, post-war. Turner took us to 1693, Dan evoked Catherine the Great, Jaina began in the late 19th century, Sylvia took us to pre-colonial mappings of desire. But this has not been the general orientation of the conference and of queer historical work more broadly, of my own work, in fact. And as we look to the urgent issues of the present, I was wondering what's lost or gained in queer history being largely a modern or contemporary history. Now, that's a huge generalization, but I think that's the kind of orientation of this subdiscipline, and I think it's worth reflecting on what that does and what that means. And finally, I was just thinking about the kind of other urgent historical project at the moment, which is environmental history, and thinking about that in the context of the climate emergency. And that's something we haven't touched in this conference, and it might be interesting to reflect a little bit on where queer history might have a role in elaborating environmental history, and so joining that political and activist struggle through history. Now, this list left me thinking over lunch about the wider trajectory of LGBT history, which has been marked from the start by outsiderness, by disregard of traditional boundaries, and a layering of approaches and tendencies which unevenly inflect and intersect in queer historical work, which we've seen in this conference, and which I think energise and are part of its creativity and potential reach. And it's worth remembering, I think, that LGBT history has most often, or often been made and mobilised beyond capital H history in the capital U university. So by the sexologists in the 1890s, by lawyers in the 1960s, by activist lesbian, gay and feminist scholars in the 70s, working outside the academy often with social history and histories from below. By members of communities who were seeing themselves silenced and dying in the 80s, by literary and film theorists insisting on the significance of power and power of language and discourse when we think about the past, by sociologists, geographers and anthropologists who suggested different ways of thinking about social roles, community formation and the significance of space and the composition and its composition, by trans activists and scholars crucially pushing an examination of how lesbian and gay and queer history relate to and intersect with trans histories, by post-colonial gender and latterly crip theorists and historians encouraging us to think ever more critically about the categories we use, including about time and space in the so-called spatial, temporal and archival terms, and about the intersections that have too often been neglected in LGBTQ work, which has looked at sexuality apart and ways that too frequently embed rather than expose racist, gendered and ableist assumptions, hierarchies and narratives. LGBT and queer history started beyond the university, and it has kept a firm foot outside, with a frequent and very healthy disregard of the boundary between academic, popular, community history, and a shuttling between these genres of work, even if epistemologies and methodologies don't always sit neatly together. I think this porousness is part of what distinguishes queer history from the more academically anchored gender history and history of sexuality, to which it is, of course, closely related. And this, I think, is part of the promise and the democratic promise of queer history. More than in other areas of history, I think there's been a real, if uneven, validation of people who collect, deposit, record, and celebrate and acknowledge in multiple ways the material that gets made into history. In history books, in film, in fiction, in walks and talks and podcasts, in virtual walking tours and more. And by people on their own behalf. So there's a kind of profusion and diversity that I think we need to celebrate beyond the history book itself. And the way in which people have made their own histories. Because I think if queer history has taught me one thing, it's that those who have had to work hard to navigate their identities and sense of belonging are often themselves very able analysts of their own lives and of the political, social and cultural and historical forces which shape and press in on them and their networks. And so this is why community-forged history has been so pivotal in LGBT queer history making and to an associated politics and activism. And I've almost done. But I just wanted to say that one of my favourite quotes from one of my favourite social historians, Raphael Samuel, the late Raphael Samuel, he observed that history was, or should be, the work not of a solo historian in their ivory tower, but of 1,000 hands. And I guess I feel like that's an aspiration for and a promise of the collective, connective endeavour of queer history going forward. And in relation to that, I'd say that I'm resistant to insisting too rigorously on a definition of this field, along the lines, for example, of a highly critically engaged intellectual history, important as that strand of queer historical work is. What I want to hold as queer history's promise is the collaborativeness, the contradictions, the boundary crossings, the intersections, to use Anzio. I'd want, in short, to hold on to queer history's messiness. And I think that's what makes it vivid and gives it its promise. That's all I want to say. It's enough. What I've got is, I have got a few questions, but I think what I'm going to do is hold them in my back pocket, because I suspect that you've all got some other things that go well beyond the questions I'd want to ask. So what I'd like to do is, if we can move along, maybe we can start with Susan and work along the panel and just think about what you see, where you think queer history needs to go or should go, and what is its promise? You know, are we running out of steam? Are we just gathering steam? What's happening to the field? You can pass the baton.
No, I was thinking as you were talking and thinking about you mentioned the very recent historical emphasis in the field, that the emphasis in queer history is by and large like a post-World War II history. And I would just say I think some of the most interesting work in both history and in trans studies is looking at early modern European history, late medieval and early modern history, because I think part of what you see there is how some very long-standing problematics about the body that you see in the so-called Western tradition start getting mapped onto an emergent world system, and that there's beliefs and ideologies about the body that inform what a lot of African American and Caribbeanist feminists have called like Sylvia Winters, who I'm thinking of in particular, called the biocentric worldview, or Maria Lugones, writing about the coloniality of gender, and that just thinking about how these beliefs about what bodily difference means and how you use bodily difference to create social hierarchy, how you use morphology and phenotype as a way of essentially creating a sense of the body as I think of it as like a carceral form, that it is something that binds bodies into places in hierarchical social systems that get mapped by Europe onto the rest of the world through colonization. And understanding how that happens, and understanding the role of, for lack of a better word, trans figures, trans, non-binary, gender-changing, doubly sexed, ambiguously sexed, androgynous figures in the Western tradition, knowing that that has always been there, and ways that those beliefs then get articulated in the emergence of a modern world system, I find to just be a really fascinating and useful project. If you're interested in that book, the book that I write, if you're interested in that topic, the book that I'm always recommending these days is by Leah Devon. It's called The Shape of Sex, Non-Binary Gender from Genesis to the Renaissance. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. And that the other thing that I would say then is that I think when you think about trans and queer in relationship to the emergence of a modern European world system, that what trans in particular means to me is that it's not a way necessarily of finding a place within the way the world is currently organized, but that it is think of it as like a practice of freedom for like saying that we can transcend and change what our bodies mean to ourselves, to our others, to our society, that there's nothing power tries to inscribe itself in our flesh, and that we can say, you know, for myself, it means something else. To my community, it means something else. And this is the place from which to imagine a world that is beyond the world that has been given to us. And so when I think about it that way, it's just like I think of trans and queer struggle as not a special minority, you know, project. It's like it's about the liberation of our lives from the powers that make our life a resource for its own reproduction. And that I feel like it puts me in community with other people who are struggling against that same power in a different way than I perhaps might do so myself, but that it's the basis for our common struggle for survival on a damaged planet. And that yeah, maybe I'll and so the other question was about ecological history or environmental history. And, you know, I would just say in my own work, like I talked about the Turk and Taylor project today. Some of the people I work with on that are people who do environmental architecture for the Anthropocene. You know, like how do you, if you're trying to imagine what would livability look like at that location, you can't ignore the fact that while it's not likely that San Francisco will be underwater in 50 years, it may well be experiencing devastating drought, and that the air quality may be such that you can't, you know, live there without, you know, without some kind of, you know, air filtration. So if you're trying to think about, well, what does livability mean there, you can't even think about it just in terms of queer and trans history or I mean, you really have to think about the fact that that location might not be that suitable for Homo sapiens, you know, in the lifetimes of people who are in this room today, although, you know, maybe not me because I'm old. And so we can't divorce the questions of queer and trans liberation from questions of environmental justice and sustainability. Or I would say you can't divorce it from questions of mourning, you know, that Anzio raised, you know, earlier. It's just like, I think the fact that it's hard to face our grief can paralyze us sometimes, and that part of our work, particularly I think if we link our queerness or transness to spiritual practices, that I think we have an opportunity, an obligation, a responsibility to be people now who might perhaps serve as a kind of death doula for human culture. On planet Earth, you know, as we imagine not only what is and what might be, but what's to come, and what's to come is perhaps something that we're not present in the same way.
Thanks, Susan. Hadley. I'm not sure what to say.
You can pass and then come back.
No, it's okay. That seems unfair. I'm still working with the death doula thing. Oh God, that's really grim. Perhaps we could also think of how sometimes revolution has to be evolution, and in a situation like this, socially and politically and environmentally, maybe something more like evolution is required. I would agree with you, Susan, that for me at least, what queer thinking and queer history means going back further than the present, and I tend to go to the early modern too, and to try to bring in the effects of post-colonial thinking on our understandings of, you know, what makes bodies and sexualities and their intersections and entanglements with race and class and gender and location and all of this, and the way in which these become incorporations of particular sets of powered circumstances, empowered for some, disempowered for others, that are, if they're incorporations, maybe they're also incarcerations, as you're saying. And so that's really important for me, but I think part of what's always critical in queer history is this revolutionary, evolutionary impulse to relate that and use it for the present, and to therefore couch that history in terms of its relevance for current crises, whether they're environmental, social, political, personal, or entanglements of all of those. So that's sort of one thought there. The other thing that I was thinking, Matt, when you mentioned the recency issue, because I agree that, well, that's what perhaps queer history is for some of us. It's true that for many people, it is quite a recent thing. It's very much a kind of late modernist phenomenon, or even a postmodern phenomenon. And I was just thinking of what that means in terms of methodologies and how we understand what an archive is, can be, might be. Do we think in terms of the artifacts of a late modern bureaucracy, statist bureaucracy, imperial documents, colonial documents, post-colonial documents, the sorts of archives that we see in people's memoirs or zines, or moments. They're still traceable in certain ways, like the Compton riots, and the stories people can tell about them. Those are certain kinds of archives, and they require certain ways of dealing with them in order to sort of unpack them, discover them, make use of them. What I'm thinking of, kind of, I'll just pose a crude contrast, is what, Hansu, you were showing us, with these sort of material things like baskets and beads and statuary. And I'm thinking, perhaps in connection with your ideas about interdisciplinarity or cross-disciplinarity, for me as an anthropologist, that makes me think of archaeological methods and a different way of thinking about archives, or Sylvia, you were showing the sort of Egyptian friezes, and so what we consider relevant archives and the ways in which we consider it appropriate or possible to examine what we might think of as a queer past really depends upon the scope of time we envision that queerness to be relevant in terms of. And then finally, I too was thinking about the mourning, which was very moving and I think really important, not only because mourning has become such a matter of conversation in queer and feminist thinking, grief, mourning, but also because I think it's always important to remember, like all of history, it's sort of doubly two-faced, if we can call it that, because mourning is, on the one hand, it's always something that looks back and yet looks forward, right? A memorialization or a funerary ceremony is always something that looks back, that we use to look back to kind of think about our future and the ways in which we're connected to it. And on the other hand, mourning is something that, well, a queer history needs, and queer people mourn, queerness is lost or voice is lost. But mourning is also kind of critical to the way in which anti-queer forces always pose their need to be anti-queer, right? Or to be sort of hetero-nationalistic, going back to, thinking about Hungary. Hungarians are always mourning the national territory and the power that they imagine was lost in 1920, in 1526. And so mourning is very kind of powerful, if I can say, for us and against us. And we should keep that in mind, I guess. So I'll stop there.
The potency of nostalgia as well in both, in similar ways, I think. Yeah, very interesting. Sylvia.
The past has a lot to say. I think we must all be historians. I think that's what I've taken away from this conference, that we have no choice, especially when you come from an oppressed group, an oppressed community, we have no choice but to become historians. We should not think of ourselves as, oh, I'm not a historian, I am a sociologist, I am those siloed disciplines that the imperialists have imposed on us very deliberately so that we only see things from one silo and don't find it difficult to connect the dots. So I think we really, it is our responsibility, it is our duty to dig into history and different, genres, different ways, formats of reading history and unearthing it, because I was a history student. I did history for my O-level, my A-level, and I got A's in the history, but it was a very orchestrated, history that was on the syllabus that they wanted me to know, that to be exposed to. And it's only through reading, much, much later, that I reached these eureka moments, I couldn't believe it. Reading about King Leopold's Congo, that was not mentioned in an African classroom, history classroom, never. The Herero and the Nama, the suffering at the hands of the Germans, they were not on the official syllabus. They are not on the official syllabus even today. The French Revolution, ooh, what sparked the French, all those things I crammed and I wrote down and I got an A. Nothing about the Haitian Revolution, which happened at the same time against the French. Those things, so we really, I think there's so many answers in history that, that explain so many things. And I think we ignore it at our own peril. And as I said, we really don't have a choice. We are all historians. We must all be transdisciplinary in our approaches to liberation and take history very, very seriously, whether it is the history of science or the history of medicine, whatever it is, because there are so many answers in history.
Thank you. Dan. Well, Oscar Wilde said, our one duty to history is to rewrite it. So that's what we must do, right? I've been very struck at this conference by something that I think is a new tone that I don't remember from conferences before the pandemic in the queer studies circles that I've traveled in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and that is really the growing sense. I don't want to say pessimism, but I want to say defensiveness. I want to say caution. I want to say political anxiety, even in our conversations. And I don't want to frighten people, but it is a new tone, I think. And that comes from the rise of populism, the rise of fascism light that we have discussed again and again over the course of these 2 days. And I think that the sort of era of history with happy endings is maybe drawing to a close. So I felt very aware of that defensive tone in the past 48 hours in our discussions. And I took heart in the mention of mourning as a form of commemoration and as a practice. I remember when I was first working on my doctorate in the early 1990s, and so many of my friends died. And I decided to turn back to my studies and to finish them at whatever cost, because it meant a lot to do something when so many people did not survive. History with a capital H. Now I'm going to defend history with a capital H a little bit here, because we've talked a lot about interdisciplinarity, and rightly about silos and about imperial forms of knowledge production. Well, if you're in that silo, do something with it, do something with those conventions. In Russia and the other countries of the former Soviet Union, I argue actually that there's still an awful lot that conventional history can do, and that can do when queer eyes go into the archive. Maybe the archive of the Stalinist state, it may be the archive of Brezhnev's oppressive late Soviet Union or the analogous states in Eastern Europe. It may be the archive of socialist China, which has been absent, regrettably, at this conference, but would have been an important presence to just complete the global set, in a sense. But I argue that queer eyes, properly educated, looking at those archives, can bring us new stories, can tell us new things that we didn't know before. And I often try to encourage younger historians to look afresh at official archives with the right education, with the right reading in queer theory, with the right reading in queer historical methods. They will yield up new secrets. They will yield up lost voices, and so on. So that's, I think, all I want. Oh, one last point about methodologies, about pathways, about sources. One thing that Anzio said that I was very struck by is, the next revolution will be, broadcast on TikTok. We need to start embracing the digital humanities in a serious way, because we're, I think, perhaps even behind the curve on that in terms of thinking about how our current movements are not recording themselves in the way that paper-based movements did.
Thanks, Dan. I was reflecting as well on what you were saying about archives. It's so crucial to think through. I think archivists have become much more cognizant of what is also within established collections. And I mean, getting signposted, the queer content is increasingly signposted, as well as our kind of techniques of reading between lines. So the colonial archive throwing up stuff that actually counters the colonial story, as well as enforcing it. So it's really key. Yeah,
I don't know how I follow.
Thank you, Dan.
But perhaps we can start with saying that the work to retrace 500 years of history is going to be a lot of work. And when we do so, we need to acknowledge what Professor Tamale suggests, that to do that work, we have to start somewhere. We have to start with what we know. We have to start with what we can reach. We have to start. I'm of a new generation that believes in breaking down to build up. Maybe this is contextual to South Africa. Maybe we've grown weary of watching the same things happen over and over again. Maybe we've grown weary and what is often termed very negatively woke culture is something that might be useful for us. Because my understanding of woke culture is to awake from a sleep. And we've been sleeping when we don't know our own histories. And so perhaps when we start to invoke woke culture, when we start to invoke restlessness, when we start to invoke mess, when we start to question why white is good and black is bad, then maybe we start to shake that archive just a little. Maybe we start to rewrite that history just a little. And perhaps we could contemplate what it would be to transplant what we are yet to mourn into the present day, to think meaningfully and acknowledge what are often termed the first peoples. Maybe we can go back and think about what identities we need to be liberated from in order to liberate ourselves, to again disrupt, to cause fissures, to mess, and to reimagine our histories in new ways. I'm very curious about the growth of this conference, Tuna. I wonder what you will be able to do with this perhaps newfound power to create a different kind of repository, to create a different kind of archive, to create a different kind of history, because there are tools that have been laid out here by some of my very esteemed colleagues that may be useful in thinking about what the role of history and archive is as repository. During the lunch break, I struggled to eat, and somebody that I was speaking to in the audience, I said, what can we do differently? And I used the pop culture reference, stay in your lane. I find it so disheartening that oftentimes the experts on our lives are not ourselves. And so what would it look like if the experts in history started to look at their own history first before looking at the histories of others? I think that it's time, in order to gain our liberation, to realize the importance of rest. If we just paused for a second and understood that the world is going by so quickly, we keep on jumping onto the next thing, we keep on looking down at a screen, trying to find the next best thing, trying to make ourselves more important. If we could just pause and rest, perhaps we could consider history in a more considerate way. And then I also wonder how Beyoncé would see history. I think it's important that we think about history in a present to acknowledge the past, because we may be able to retrieve a past in history, but we live in the present and are creating futures. And so what does it mean to rest? What does it mean to stop? What does it mean to break away? What does it mean to disrupt? What does it mean to fissure? I think that the colonial trajectory is one of divide and conquer. And so the more divided we are, the more a colonial trajectory is able to conquer. And just as a closing thought, if we think about our histories and we don't think about our histories in tandem with the environment, are we really thinking about our histories? Because we are not separate from our environments. I often, or when I try and dream in my home language, I think about Pangaea. I wonder what that looked like. I wonder what we could learn from that time. Maybe we can unearth history there and try and contemplate what we could have looked like before we became so separatist. And in that, I hope that we are able to move to a just transition. A just transition in the environmental space is a just transition for everybody, acknowledging perhaps that we need to take seriously the role of our rivers, the roles of our forests, the roles of our land, in the ways that we imagine ourselves, in the ways that we're trying to create our future, because our history is what destroyed the thing that we are now so carefully trying to preserve. Maybe in that way, the last shall be first and the first shall be last.
Thank you. Colleagues, did you want to comment or riff off anything you've said, anybody else has said?
I must admit, I'm not on TikTok.
Me neither. Who is on TikTok? One of the things I was thinking about is I'm really interested in these kind of porous kind of, the kind of bridging academic and popular history and so on and so forth. But one of the things I think I've observed over the last 20 or 30 years is a shift in the queer historical environment. And by that I don't mean history done over there and consumed deliberately, but more a kind of shifting awareness of how history is all around us, our queer history is all around us, in a very different way from, I mean, in the UK context, I really had to go find it in 1990. And it feels like increasingly over the last 10 years, it's more tangible, it's talked about more, it's, you know, there's something on TV, or there's a blue plaque, or there's people are talking about the past in a different way, or in a maybe more enveloping way. And I wondered if you had parallel thoughts about the kind of historical environment we exist in. And I think, I mean, I relate that also to a broader kind of appetite for history, for popular history. And the kind of development of queer history has been part of that. But I'm thinking about that, I suppose, in quite a specific context. And I'm just wondering if you have parallel reflections on shifting queer or trans historical environments that we exist within.
To develop our own algorithms. Because you know how this information, you know how the algorithms have read us and they pop messages, unsolicited messages to you because they've seen you reading. So I think we need to find our own ways of popping counter narratives, counter histories into people's computers and just like they do it. Because it's very difficult to come across these histories in mainstream readings. So we have to be very deliberate in making it popular, making it, known to the Arkellos of this world, really. And I'm very serious. Those of you who are technology savvy, we need to come up with our own algorithms that counter, what are their names? Those big guys in big tech.
Well, just to pick up on that, just a couple of things that I'm interested in as a historian right now is two things. One is about sort of digital humanities, and I've been following the work of some people who are doing what they call human-centered artificial intelligence, where it's like they're training some of these new AIs that can do natural language processing, feeding them huge data sets of just all kinds of historical content. And like this one project I was looking at, they had ingested into this natural language program like everything that was in the US congressional record and all of these recordings of people speaking on the floor of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it was like, it was like terabytes of information over centuries, but they were using it to investigate history of concepts. Like, how is it that immigration, let's use that as a key word, has been talked about, in public political discourse in the US, and that they could trace over time the way that immigration as a concept had changed. It's like I would love to do something like that for gender. It's like I'm quite serious about wanting to do something like that about gender, to use these new AI tools that we've got big data sets for thinking about histories of ideas in ways we have not been able to really talk about empirically before. But then I say my own work is very public facing. It's like, and I do that on purpose. I love getting down into the weeds and having wonky, nerdy history and archives conversations with people. But then I'm always thinking about how do you tell stories about this, and who are you telling stories to, which is why I got interested in filmmaking. It's why I do a lot of consulting and producing work in commercial media. I sort of joke about it and say, why teach 15 people in a seminar when you can teach 15 million people on Netflix? And I'm serious about that. It's like putting content into and sometimes even the most banal kinds of mass media. It just becomes a way that things circulate to audiences who would not be exposed to it otherwise. And it's why I'm working on a trade book for the general audience right now rather than a scholarly monograph. So anyway, there's many ways for us to do our work as historians and activists and thinkers. That's the way that I try to do mine right now.
Perhaps I can share that in the South African context, to pay the bills, I often do DEI work in corporate spaces. And recently, well, maybe not so recently, a year or two ago, I was sitting at home watching TV, and I was frustrated because I was watching live TV, which we don't really do anymore, and there were a lot of adverts. And I was frustrated by the fact that I knew so many queer black creators who were part of the advertising industry in South Africa, and yet there were very scant queer black representation available on our screens, especially in the space of advertising. And so for all of their problems, that's a whole different panel. One of the big advertising campaigns that has been recurrent over probably the last 30 years in South Africa is that of Cremora. It's a coffee creamer. And so there's this very famous ad that comes out in the 80s in South Africa, I think for the first time. And the husband goes to the fridge and he says, "Honey, where's the Cremora?" And she says, "It's not inside, it's on top." And he says, "It's not inside, it's on." And he looks up and he sees the Cremora. And this resonated for some reason in South Africa. And the ad recurred, and it came back several times. And at the beginning of COVID, I sat down with the team and I said, what would it look like if you thought differently about this advert and inserted your own narratives in the ad? And so this is the second year that the campaign has come back after that conversation. In the first year, we had a black woman represented as a lesbian in the advert. She was actually a lesbian. They put a lesbian on screen, a black lesbian on screen. Wonderful. And this time round, there's a black trans woman in the ad. They are fuller-figured people in the ads. They are young people, old people, every kind of mix of people in these ads, and they're saying the exact same thing, but I think that the audience that they are reaching are far wider, which is great for Cremora, but I think more importantly for our movement, because I think that when we see ourselves in history in the making, much like young black children being able to pick up a black Barbie now with an afro, it tells us that we exist in ways that we didn't exist before. And so there's a very powerful opportunity that exists now in using the mediums like film, these forward-facing mediums, to tell history in ways that we couldn't do before.
From what you were saying, Matt, I thought of a chapter I wrote, the final chapter of Russian homophobia from Stalin to Sochi, where I compared two public monuments. One is the monument to Alan Turing in Manchester, and the computer inventor during the Second World War who helped to break German codes, and who was a war hero, who was a gay man and who was arrested, convicted, and committed suicide in 1952. The monument to him, and a monument to a Soviet singer, Vadim Kozin, on the other side of the continent in the city of Magadan, which is on the Pacific coast of Russia, and which resembles, the two monuments resemble each other very, very closely. But they couldn't be more different in terms of the language of commemoration that's used around them. Kozin was a gay man who was sent by Stalin to the Gulag in 1945 and spent the rest of his life in Magadan, even though he was only in prison for 5 years. And he is not remembered by the city fathers who put up that statue for that persecution, but for his song, but for his singing. And so his the entire wreath of commemoration, the penumbra around him, the discourse and so on, is about his singing career. And I think what we have to remember is that the algorithm is different in different contexts, in different cultures, and that what is legible and what is readable in the Anglosphere doesn't necessarily export. And LGBT communities in Magadan have actually tried to amplify this history by talking about Kozin's homosexuality online and through biography as well, to offer a counter-history, a counter-narrative that's very important, but that public commemoration is something quite different, I think, from the kinds of channels of communication and commemoration that we may be able to use to communicate with our own communities.
Yeah, and that double reading as well. Adley.
Somehow I feel like this relates. What I was thinking, Matt, when you asked that, is it made me think of Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a graphic novel about the Holocaust with animals as sort of the different people. And Art Spiegelman is writing about his father's experience in the Holocaust. Jews are represented as mice. The Germans are cats. Americans are dogs. I don't remember what else. Anyway, and one of the things that Spiegelman says quite early on, I think he's talking about his difficult relationship with his father, the Holocaust survivor. And he says, "My father bleeds history," which is to say, you cut him and he gets a little cut and history pours out. And it just always stuck with me because I feel like in the ways in which we think about history, which I think includes the ways in which we understand the relationship of different people's bodies to history, I think we often imagine that, well, some people bleed history more than others, just as some people have history more than others. Spiegelman's writing about his father, who's a East Central European Jew, certainly somebody who, in post-World War II narratives and probably older narratives, in the West are seen as people who definitely bleed history. It's a whole region that bleeds history. And I'm just wondering, how do we think about, rather than just, because I think that the ways in which we divide a world into people who bleed history and people who don't, or people who have history and people who don't, and again, I'm thinking, as I think I mentioned yesterday, of Eric Wolf's book, Europe and the People Without History. If we divide a world like that, what do we do when we give people history? And to whom do we give history? Queer people become people who bleed history. When we make queer people, whatever we mean by that, people who bleed history, who are we not making people who bleed history? And what are the consequences of that? Again, this is back to this question we were talking about yesterday. What happens when you try to create a history? When you create a new algorithm, just like when you create new forms of artificial intelligence, to some extent, you put certain things in, and they do certain things, and you leave other things out. What are the consequences of that? And I think we just need to keep that in mind and remember that it really does connect to people's body and people's blood, people's bleeding.
That's the sense of ourselves as historical beings. And the varying degrees in which we can feel that, I suppose.
Yeah, so that was my thought.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I was thinking as well about how, I think, Susan, you said yesterday, or in one of the panels, or maybe it was another speaker, about how we make the histories that we want right now. I mean, it tells us always more about our context than the time we're talking about, inevitably. But I was thinking about how, in a way, history, I think over the last 20 years and longer, has also been used, queer history has also been used quite instrumentally. So just as a kind of narrow example, in the UK, we have this heritage lottery fund where you can apply for money, and it used to be that it was for big capital projects like the Opera House, whatever. And in 2002, they allowed small community groups to apply for smaller amounts of money to do projects. And 127 LGBT projects community history projects have kind of come out of that. And some of those have come out of community groups that have been anchored in history. But other groups have come up with history projects because their community group needs some money and there's no other source of money. And I'm quite interested in that kind of way of, and one of the things Heritage Lottery Fund wants to do is community building. So there's this really interesting kind of circular thing where, we'll use history to do this, because that's how we can get some money to do something, to get a community worker or a youth worker, and that's how we can work together. But then history does become the kind of glue for that group in a kind of backwards motion. And I was thinking something similar in San Francisco with these, I was really bemused by these plaques on some shops, heritage businesses, and I was thinking, what is this? And I was talking to one shop owner who said, well, you get the heritage business denomination and it allows you some protection from renting, I can't remember, but some sort of, from redevelopment or whatever. So it becomes a way of preserving the building. So it's like whether or not the shop owner is actually interested in their heritage or, this is a way of protecting ourselves. So in a way, history becoming a kind of shield. I mean, a literal shield in terms of, or a literal way to get money in those contexts, limited amounts of money, but nevertheless. So there's something quite interesting about the way in which our historical environment enlarges, not only through some sort of pure passion for history, but because it can kind of do some stuff, some actual stuff in the here and now.
Yeah, I think for better and worse. As you were talking, I was thinking what Evren was saying yesterday about ways that history becomes a way of folding people into citizenship, and it's like double-edged sword, because of course just like you don't want the state to be hostile to your life, nor do you necessarily want to imagine that it's going to be your protector somehow. Maybe like the histories we need are ones that are more disruptive of the way that power is organized, rather than like stories that fold us into the body politic somehow. But the thing you were mentioning in San Francisco, there's because the real estate market there is so, it just sucks the air out of your lungs. It's so expensive to be there now, that there was a public program to have businesses declared legacy businesses, right? And like the lesbian dive bar in the Mission, where there's like queer salsa dancing on the patio on the weekends. It's like they didn't have enough business to like keep it open on a, just on a strictly, capitalist basis, so they could argue that they provided a benefit to the social and historical fabric of the city, and there could be rent stabilization money that like keeps legacy businesses open. There was again, two-edged sword. I mean, some of the pushback against that was, well, what you're doing is taking public money and putting it in private pockets, and so is that a good thing to do? I mean, it's a transfer of money from a tax base to a property owner. And there were some people like, that's not actually how we need to empower our communities. And other people were going like, it's keeping a business open and giving people jobs, and we got a place to eat and drink and socialize, and I'm totally fine with that. But yeah,
the pragmatics of it are really,
the pragmatics of it. The thing I say about history a lot is like, history is the story that confers realness on a past we need, and it's not, the past is not carved in stone. It's like we can kind of keep asking the past, asking the records of the past that we can retrieve. What can you tell me about the story that I need to find?
Yeah. I guess in a moment what I'll do is open up to questions and comments from everyone else, but I wanted to just reflect, maybe continuing that conversation a little bit, about what we do. I mean, given the very close kind of political connection between queer and trans history and a contemporary politics, what do we do with the histories that are unpalatable to us, the queer and trans histories that are unpalatable? I remember working on this this English couple, and I was really fascinated by them, and I wrote a chapter about them and their queer domesticity, and I got all invested in these people until I read in a letter his praise for the incomparable fascisti in Italy, and my heart sank, and I was like, oh, what do I do with these guys now? I don't want them in my book, but they're in there. And I kept them in there. But I had quite a visceral reaction to this, a couple that in a way I'd been quite seduced by their story, by what they were doing in London and so on. And then suddenly, boom, there was this part of their politics which was so despicable. So there's something really interesting about what we do when we want a history to serve the present and serve a future. What do we do with the unpalatable and the people and trends and so on?
I think that history makes them human. I mean, no human doesn't have unpalatable past or even present. It just makes them human. It's part of who they are. And so I don't think you should hide it or, make them angels when they were not, because none of us is an angel. We all have our secrets. We all have, those unpalatable parts of our lives. It just makes them human.
There was a very interesting, I suppose, exhibit yesterday morning that asked people to trace their identity in the way that they've been called, I think, by using different color string. And it tied these strings to all of the identities applicable to them. And I wonder if this isn't perhaps instructive. When these histories come up, they speak to positionalities that are important for location. And so while they may be deeply uncomfortable, they have to be seen. I think that this is perhaps one of the big lessons that I learned during the student movement. Rhodes Must Fall sought to remove Rhodes from the university. I didn't agree with where Rhodes was placed, but certainly that history is a part of our history and lets us know that something bad happened that we need to avoid happening again. And so, while we may move statues, while we may move history to other parts, it is important to trace it so that we can trace ourselves.
Yeah. Dan, did you want to come in?
Yeah. I mean, there was a popular book that's just come out called Bad Gays. Yeah. I think it's by Trummell and Miller, and it's an amusing read and a thought-provoking read about in gay biography, dipping your toe into gay biography. It's focused really on gay men only, but one figure in that book is Nikolai Yezhov, who orchestrated Stalin's Great Terror in 1936, 37, 38, who was bisexual, or at least who was accused of bisexuality and of homosexual offenses when he was arrested in 1940 and executed. I'm not saying that, I think I agree with you very much, Sylvia, that it is just a part of human nature, and it makes us human to understand those stories. And I think we're way past the infantile gay and lesbian history stage where everybody had to be a queero, a hero, someone who had an exemplary story to tell us.
But it's interesting too, isn't it, that I absolutely agree. I think there's something interesting about how also I've been tutored, I suppose, in kind of 70s, 80s kind of social cultural history and the kind of binding of lesbian and gay LGBT lives with a particular politics. The way in which we were aligned with the left. And so finding these historical figures who had no such alignment and wouldn't even think of an alignment necessarily, it's interesting to mark those moments in yourself of surprise, because it often brings you up against the kind of the ways in which we're all historicized in a particular politics or cultural milieu, I think.
Romanticized.
It's back to ideas about environmental history or metaphors even. It's like, we live in a planet that has a lot of toxicity that has been surfaced now, and we always live in proximity to the toxic now. And it's like, I think that happens in our histories as well, and that we should not necessarily desire a pure history. It's like we're always in proximity to things that have been deadly for ourselves and others. Some of the most positive things that we try to do, we do from, I live in a nation that was founded on stolen land and stolen labor, and yet I find positive things to do there. It's like I live in proximity to that toxic history. I think there can be differences between stories we tell ourselves and stories that we tell other people. Sometimes we can tell stories defensively to ward off a certain kind of use of history that we would not see want to weaponize against us. But that, for those of us who are speaking inside a messy we of queer and trans, however we want to define that it strengthens us to know ways that things that we believe in actually have an underside to them that can be quite ugly and messy. It's like, I think about this as a trans person. It's kind of like there's some nasty shit in cisgender gay and lesbian and feminist movements that I feel in alignment with, but it's just like I differ from on certain issues. Or the whole question of transnational feminisms, the quip about, it's like white women saving brown women from brown men, right? And so it's just like, does that mean I'm anti-feminist? It's like, no, but you need to know the ways that these tools that we use actually have these toxic legacies encoded into them. And there's nothing incompatible about being queer or feminist with being fascist. Right. Just like let's just say that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that really interesting dance, I think, of queer and normal in a sense. The way in which every individual is invested in a series of entrenched norms, as well as potentially finding some scope or intervening, intersecting scope for difference in there. It's really interesting.
Maybe I can just take this back to Dan, I think you were the one who mentioned the concept of gay shame.
Yes.
And to just think, part of the queer analytic with gay shame is that the politics that tries to escape shame to purify shame for a kind of pure pride has led to this notion of the pure and the heroic, which is really problematic. And what we should try to do is embrace the shame, because that can inform a sense of pride that's rather richer and more meaningful and more potentially useful. That's not just pride, but that's both combined.
Well, and it's more textured. I mean, the problem with the eulogized pride is that you can feel like you never measure up to this kind of...
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was Chinua Achebe, and I hate to quote people because I always worry I'll do it wrong, but he said something along the lines in one of his books of only a foolish man would spit out the juicy morsel. And I think this is quite a useful thing to think about. One, in relation to pride, because when we talk about the first shall be last and last first, I wonder how this plays out in queer realities in the present. I certainly remember Johannesburg Pride was the largest pride on the African continent for many years. In 2012, I attended that pride, could be 2011, history and memory. And so I remember at that pride there was a spate in hate crimes that resulted in the deaths of black lesbian women who lived in townships. And this pride took place in a suburb and was largely attended by middle-class people. And so there was an intervention at this pride where some activists from a campaign called 1 in 9, drawing attention to kind of femicide, largely in South Africa, paused the parade by putting cadavers that they'd made out of stockings and newspaper on the ground and said, "Stop, we need to have a moment to mourn." And there is the most horrific footage of I think I say almost word for word the white head of the Pride organization saying to black lesbian women, "Go back to where you came from." And this was the last Joburg Pride in that form. Joburg Pride has come back in another form now, even more ghastly than the first. But that is one instance that I can think of. I think of another where students are together and trans students have to kind of identify themselves as they're being erased from the student movement history. And this, I think I spoke to yesterday. And then as a final example, I think in many of the trans movements that are emerging, especially in Southern Africa, as that's where I'm located, what has become extremely frustrating and apparent is that the trans movement has been led by trans men to the exclusion of trans women. And then when you start to proliferate that transness or that trans continuum, non-binary people in the Southern African movement can only be non-binary in as far as they are white. And I say this engaging the movement directly, where there's a concern that if you don't present in a particular way, that you can't identify in a particular way, and particularly in an African context, this is very difficult. There's a colleague of mine from Tunisia who identifies as a trans woman, but often presents as a cis man. And this is a very complex thing that we need to deal with, and we've got to grapple with questions of race, we've got to grapple with questions of class, we've got to grapple with questions of gender, we've got to grapple with questions of continuums, because these things are in play in many facets of our societies, not only in LGBTQIA++++, but certainly in our day-to-day realities. What happens when our LGBTQIA+ movements are started by white gay men? Does that mean that white gay men do not have a place in our movements? What does it mean when trans men are leading the kind of battle for trans lives in our movement? Does that mean that they need to be erased because they're taking up too much space? And I think that maybe this leads me to the point that I want to drive across, is that we need to understand when we are taking up space and how we are taking up space, because sometimes we speak when we don't need to. We speak for, we speak on behalf of, and sometimes it's okay just to shut up. Sometimes it's okay not to have an opinion. Sometimes it's okay to let the others speak. And maybe this can be part of our praxis.
Well, in the present and in terms of historical space as well, and that's visibly right. Thanks so much, everyone. What I want to do is see if we've got any comments or questions from the audience. We've got about sort of 10 or 15 minutes left before we finish, and we can use that time or not. I mean, people might want to take a breather, but do come and ask questions or make comments if you'd like.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for everything this past 2 days. You all work in academia, not all of you, but some of you. And I noticed that you said, Dan, that it's kind of been a change of tone these past 2 days, that you're more defensive. I think my opinion is that you're very, very humble, all of you. And I wonder, how do you sort of contribute to an environment around you in the academia where people, where you see it as a strength to be vulnerable and humble, rather than being less knowledgeable, or how can I say this? I find it really hard to sometimes contribute to a space where new perspectives can come in, because there's this clinging on to knowing the answers in a way. And I guess in the academia, and especially in your field, that is also an issue. But I think it's really nice to have that approach where it's more open and where you can let new knowledge in that is not necessarily from an academic background. And I just want to hear your advice or approach to how to kind of create that environment where it's not that bad to be wrong, or it's kind of like looked at as something good to be vulnerable and not so arrogant in knowing the answers. And I think this is something that you can apply to other institutions, such as the art institutions, where there are also hierarchies. And kind of a strength to know the answer. Yeah, if you have any advice on how to create that environment.
That's actually a really lovely contribution and question. And what I'd like to do is gather the 3 questions we've got together, and then we'll come back, if that's all right, to the... Thank you so much.
Hi. This is kind of a question that I already discussed during the lunch hour with Anzio, and I'm sorry because I was one of the people that made you not have your, or kept you from having lunch. So I'm sorry about that.
In a second.
But we were discussing changing the archive or renewing the archive, etc., etc. That's been a topic for this day. And I'm going to read the question because I don't remember the full one. But if we're going to shuffle or rethink the archive, that will require power structures to give up their power to define what is valuable and not valuable information. And how do we get to that point where we can have that conversation as equals?
Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you very much to the panel. It was a great pleasure to attend the conference and to be at this panel. And I'm not really sure where I'm going with what I want to say, but I've got a little anecdote, and probably the question is, when the history is about us and we are making our own history, how do we make sure that our voices are the voices that write and tell that history? And I refer to what we made as a collective in Oslo earlier this summer. I was part of a collective of activists called Reclaim Pride Oslo. We started with the aim of reclaiming back pride from the capitalist hands that have taken hold of it. And suddenly we were at the center of creating the prides that we had after the terrorist attacks on the 25th of June. It was us that created the parade on the Saturday, and it was mainly us that arranged the memorial on the Monday that was first cancelled, and then it was held anyway. And we were a group of migrants, Muslims, disabled, Sami, indigenous people, non-binary people, trans people, queer of colors, getting together in a very kind of flat structure, wanting to make change. And we made change, and we wrote history in a way in Norway 3 months ago. But already as soon as we did that, stories and narratives started to come out, talking about spontaneity. Things happened out of nowhere, kind of like already from our own people, from other queer people that were not involved in the movement, talking about how basically things started out of nowhere, erasing the work of people that were behind it. So how do we make sure that our voices are telling the history that we are making ourselves now?
Thank you so much. So there's 3 really interesting questions there. One about humbleness and sustaining ourselves in our historical work in whatever context. Another about how we're going to shuffle the archive and think through what's valuable, what's not valuable. And then this question of voice and how we make sure our voices are the ones that make our history. Does anybody want to pitch in?
Maybe I can start with the question about humility. Gail Rubin, by the way, has a tremendous piece on humility. I think it's the first piece in the Gay Shame volume that Dan was referring to. It's very short. I really recommend it. I think it's called A Little Humility. Is that right? I sometimes use it to start my classes. I really recommend it. It's about sort of unexpected consequences, and it's a historical article. I think that, partly it's a matter of trying to, just to use the terms that I was using before, it's a matter of getting away from this kind of heroic history of purification and trying to escape from one's shame, including one's shame over one's fallibility, right, or uncertainties. And maybe embracing that a little bit so that you don't have to do the overcompensatory mechanism of being defensive in that sense. I think that's what makes people defensible. I think that's different from the kind of defensiveness you were talking about, Dan, but it's something that a lot of us feel. And to recognize that, you are fallible and so is everyone else. A lot of people, particularly perhaps in academia, spend a lot of time overcompensating for their sense of insecurity by acting as if they're not insecure. I think, in my experience, a lot of people learn this in graduate school, right? You put up this defensive shield of, well, of course I'm not uncertain. And then the next thing you know, you're an asshole. And so keep hold of the shame, right? And I think that there's actually also some techniques that are useful for this, practical techniques, that I've tried to employ. So one thing is that academia, a lot of it is kind of this grandstanding. If you go to a lot of conferences, it's presentation of one sort of thing after another. No one gets to speak to anyone else. Everyone's just like, here's me, and then here's me, and that's kind of all you get, right? And as I've gone further on and gotten older, I've started to refuse to join normal panels and to insist that instead we hold roundtables where there's more conversation between people and with audiences. And so that's a way to try to make intellectual work more dialogic, if you like, right? And then another, just a quick trick, which I started doing in grad school when I was confronted with all of these people who were performing certainty. I started to feel incredibly insecure, and so I started first unconsciously tacking on to pretty much everything I said, does that make sense? So I'd say that in class. And eventually I realized, well, that's actually a kind of opening move, right? That I don't have to do just because I'm not sure whether it makes sense. And so I still try to do it a lot, just to sort of stick on the end something that turns it from a bit of from a declarative, a statement of certainty to, would you like to participate in the sense making? And this kind of personal politics, I think, can actually really help. So that's my advice.
This is so interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking about, I had on this same question, a colleague said to me very recently, he was asking me, what are you working on? And I'm just finishing off a project. I said, I'm just starting this other project, or hoping to start a project on queer work. And he said, aren't you over queer?
So over.
And I felt, what was so interesting was that my immediate reaction was not, oh, F you, but, oh, maybe I should be, or, the immediate kind of the shame that you're talking about. And I realised actually that what I find sustaining is networks and community. And I don't mean that in the sense of the kind of professional networking, but when I think about kind of the people that I've worked with in community groups, making history with FAll, collecting, depositing, doing this work, and being part of Turner's group here in Bergen, gathering with you all here, this is the sort of thing that actually is sustaining. And I think my tip would be to hold the faith with the community that matters, not with arrogant colleagues. And I think that's really important, and you need to be I've needed to be proactive in that, because otherwise I think I would have sunk with some of the commentary or comments that I've had over the years professionally. Because usually there's only one queer or gender historian in a university department, so that's not necessarily the place where you're going to find the community that you're looking for. Other comments or questions?
Yes, I think on this issue of humbling, academics being humble, I think academics must be humble because the politics of knowledge production and knowledge construction and decolonizing it requires that we lift the veil of knowledge that you find in journals, in books, with these grandstanding authors who have constructed it on the backs of people they interviewed, and then they get using this weapon of copyright and this commodifying knowledge instruments to pretend that it is their knowledge, when really, and the fact that very few people read the books and the articles that we publish. They gather dust. And I think that is why, in many ways, which really, I thought it was a huge contradiction for attacking, what's his name? The one who was attacked on stage.
Oh, Rushdie.
Rushdie. Because actually, by talking about it, you attract people to read. Otherwise, people they're not interested in especially the academic, the academic rubbish that we write. They're just not interested. It's not interesting, it's not appealing. I mean, you pick up a book and it's so opaque. You say, what are you saying? So I think, as we think about writing queer histories and the histories of other minority groups, I think it is extremely important that we use language that will be and formats that are much more appealing, Netflix, than those things that gather dust and don't mean anything. But the main point I'm making is that we really need to be humble, because otherwise, when we commodify knowledge, it's a very capitalist thing to do. And you always, as I said earlier, people get a framework of what they want to say, and they find data to justify or to prove what it is. This old paradigm argument. You find a paradigm, okay, black people are backward, black people are, and then you find the data to prove what you want to say. So I'm not a big fan of academics. Maybe that's why I resigned.
Well, just quickly
Please,
comment on that. Just like I share your ambivalence for the academy. I think about a U.S. Queer scholar of religion, Anne Pellegrini, who said something once that I really liked. She says, academics, remember, if you work for a university, you work either for the state, a corporation, or a religion.
True.
Right? Mm-hmm. And that, I think it's really important to think about the, what you call it, the political economy of knowledge production, that the academic institution is part of larger capital and state and religious institutions, and that the knowledge it legitimates serve particular ends. It's not necessarily like this place of free exchange of ideas. I'm really influenced by a book by Roderick Ferguson called The Reorder of Things, which is about the relationship between the university and, in particular, the development of ethnic studies departments and gender studies and sexuality studies. And Rod writes about, he's just like, well, there was a student movement in the 60s. There was like student movements in an alliance with what was then called like third world or post-colonial liberation movements. It's like that you had like a demand for like black revolution in the US. And what do you get instead of revolution? You get a Department of African American Studies. Right, and what's the how is it that the university becomes part of containing knowledge and containing the possibilities for social transformation and giving us something else instead? And then the last piece I'll say that I love to read and that I assign to my students quite a bit is by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who have, there's a whole book they did called The Undercommons, but there's one chapter that was called The Undercommons and the University, or the University and the Undercommons. And the idea there is that there's a lot of stuff that goes on upstairs in the university, but that's where the big men in the suits and ties, like do their official business, but that where the real work of the university happens is in what they call the Undercommons of the Enlightenment. Like that's where the work really gets done. That's where what they call the maroon communities live, who are in the house, but not necessarily of the house. And that is where, the work gets done, and that they talk about the need to steal from the university. It's like I heard Moten be asked this question. It's like, what do you mean like steal? It's like, no, I mean like you leave the doors unlocked at night so people can sleep there. You steal the rolls of toilet paper to give to people, who might need it. Just like the university it's well resourced, and that you need to be in it as a way of practicing a redistributive economy, of tangible things as well as knowledge. And so there's always that ambivalence of like doing what you need to do in the university so that you can stay there, but that you've always got a kind of double consciousness going on of like, how do you use the resources of the place in a way that actually serves the communities and networks that you find yourself to be part of? How do you reproduce them through the resources that the university might not actually be willing to give you? So
I think that is the perfect note to end on. What I'm really aware of is that we haven't addressed the question about the archive and making our voices heard, but we have run out of time. So what I'm suggesting is that do continue the conversation after this panel. We can do that. Think about those questions informally afterwards. And it just remains for me to thank the organisers once again. Thank Tuna, and thank the panel for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you all as well.
So this has been 2 very intense days. My head feels like a popcorn machine going wild. I will need quite a while to try to intellectually and emotionally process some of the things that has been said during these 2 days. And some of you have mentioned my name, but that's just because I've written a lot of emails. But we have been a really great program committee for this conference. The GRIP project with Bjørn Bertelsen, and Law Exchange with Siri Gloppen, Kari Jegerstedt and Skok, the Center for Gender Studies, and Heidi Rafto at Skeivt Arkiv. And together we created a program with speakers we wanted to listen to, and those were you. And I would also say that this program committee seems like also a kind of some new and fruitful alliances within the University of Bergen. And also many thanks to all the practical helpers at UIB and from Bergen Live. You have all been wonderful and great and done a fantastic job. And thank you so much to the audience. Some of you have come from far away to be at this conference, and you are a really diverse and interesting group. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to meet all of you, but I want to thank all of you for participating and for creating such a warm and nice atmosphere at the conference. And then I want to thank our chairs of the sessions and chairs of the panels. You are all experts on the issues we have discussed, and your insights and comments and questions, as well as the orderly organizing of your sessions, has been an important part of the conference. And finally, of course, our speakers. You have taught us, you have challenged us, and you have moved us. And you have listened to each other, and you have listened to us. You were all our first choices, and you all accepted, and we are so grateful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let history, research, and the struggles continue. Livable lives for all. Thank you.